Thanks for coming to listen to a little bit about the evidence leaders in education. I'm going to just give a very short and potted version of what ELEs are all about, but hopefully that will help people trying to apply for the status of being an ELE. So in this, what we're trying to do in the session are those two things. Describe what exactly an ELE does and how they're involved, and explain how that works within the Research School Network, and also to look at the recruitment process. So to start with, I'm just going to give a bit of a background on ELEs and the Research School Network. And just to describe what an ELE is, an evidence leader in education. So it's a type of system leader, and I'll go into a little bit of detail about what one of those is as well. So as a research school, we're part of the Research School Network, and we can appoint system leaders for education, evidence-informed educational practice. The crucial thing is that they're evidence-informed practitioners. So they're not to be confused with researchers or teacher researchers. They are just people who use evidence in a professional way as part of the work that they do in education. So the Research School Network, there's around 40 schools in the Research School Network. Some of those are associate research schools, so they're not a full research school. They're just tagged on to another research school to cover a particular geographic area, and may become a research school in their own right in the future. So we were appointed or accredited as a research school in September 2019 with the most recent round of that, and we're kind of, as you can see, one of the little black dots up here in the northeast of England. So you can see where the research schools are and how they're spread around, and that's what we mean by the Research Schools Network. So this is quite an important part of what I'm going to say today, and that is about the purpose of the Research School Network and why it was set up in the first place. And put simply, and I've seen it written in many different ways, the key thing is trying to break the connection between family income and family background and educational outcomes, and therefore improve the life chances for disadvantaged pupils in particular. But it's for everybody. But what we want to do is have a country and a system that's fair for everyone, and that's what the research school is there for. Now, the reason for that is the disadvantage gap is big, and in light of COVID is probably worse than it's ever been, but it starts very young and grows as children grow with it. So it's something that lots of different measures tell exactly the same story, but what the Research School Network is trying to do is to try to break that connection and therefore narrow or close that gap. System leaders are people who work beyond their own setting, and I think that's quite important, because obviously there might be some work in school that results of being an ELE, but also it provides the opportunity for people to work outside of their own setting. Now that might be within the trust, but it may be further afield as well. I'll come to that, how that's allocated later. Now, a standard set of system leaders, if you like, this is what the SLE description was from the National College of Teaching and Leadership. That's the kind of things that they would do. So sharing practice, providing coaching, and some form of formal deployment, i.e. school improvement. An ELE is slightly different to an SLE and the other kinds of system leaders, because an SLE would have to commit a certain proportion of their time every year as part of that work. Now, we're not asking ELEs to do that, because we don't quite know when or where we'll need you, and it's not fair to ask you to give up 6 days that you may never use, and then some years might say, actually, do you know what, we need more of a particular type of support or type of thing. So as a result, we've divorced the two, so that one is the status is one thing and the time commitment is something that's to be negotiated at a later point. So essentially this gets you the status and the permission up front, so you can say, look, I'm one of these people who can be deployed, and then as and when that comes, that can be negotiated with yourself and with your head teacher, head of the organisation, whoever that would be. It is important to say that we work locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Okay, not a lot internationally, but there's a potential for that to grow. So that where you end up is kind of dependent upon the deployment. Just to give you an idea of how it works, other research schools have just gone for the overarching badge of ELE. We've decided to be a bit more specific about it. So we have 5 different ELE status levels, if you like. So you can see them on the table there. There's the governance ELE, an executive ELE, which is a bit like a national league of education. And then you've got SLEs, which are kind of equivalent to our ELE and senior ELE. So a senior ELE would be the person who perhaps would deploy other ELEs and might, if there's a big project, senior ELE would be in charge of that, and the ELEs who can work within that project. We also have the status of aspiring ELE. So these are practitioners who perhaps aren't yet working as an ELE or working at that level, but at some point in the near future might well do, and therefore would benefit from accessing the training and the support that the ELE program will provide. Just quickly on this idea of evidence-informed practice, and this is where some people can get a little confused with the term evidence-based practice. So evidence-based practice is widely regarded as a term where basically you're thinking about using evidence. Evidence-informed practice usually distinguishes itself by talking about this idea of professional expertise. So as practitioners, we tend to use evidence, but an expert practitioner would actually do some work in contextualizing that to make it work with their context and children that they've got. And that is what we mean by evidence-informed practice. So if you've been using practice which has an evidence background to it, don't feel that that's, you've got to have a certain level of evidence or different types of research, or it's, we've probably all in our practice used it enough to tick the evidence box. It's about how we then use that in what we do. And that's a key distinction that I just want you to bear in mind as we're kind of going through the next part. How to apply, what you need to do. First of all, the vacancies for the ELEs are on the CALMA website, and there are 3 forms that come with that. And as part of that, I'm just going to talk you through the process and the kind of things that the forms are asking about. So this first round, the deadline is midday next Friday, which I appreciate is not long away. And then the interviews will be on the 7th of May in the afternoon. There will be a second round that follows up after round 1. And if we I think we have 6 places in the first round for interviews. If we get many more than that, then what we will do is we'll look to prioritize those interviews in order of need, not application strength. So if we say, can you come to a first round interview, that is because you're not only have you met the threshold, but you've also perhaps have something that we need sooner rather than later, or something we're aware of. So if we say we will put your application through to a next round for consideration, don't take that as any kind of slight on yourself or any offence. It is just that we do have to do it we have a limited capacity to recruit, and we've just got to make the best use of it. So there will be plenty of people potentially who could be in that position. The form itself has a grid in it, and I've already had a question about this, about what you need to put in the right hand side. So basically this is a tick list to make sure that you've got the right kinds of things, and if you're ticking most or all of the boxes, an ELE application, it just saves you writing the rest of the stuff. If you feel like you're getting most of those or all of those, you're going to be the kind of person that is going to fit this role. But you don't need to, I mean, it's a very small box for a reason. You don't need to say anything more than 3 years as 2 years as. It is literally just a point or note in that the detail of that application is there. So it's a small box. It really doesn't need to be massively huge. Okay. The second part is made up of 5 questions, and there are word limits on those. For those particular questions, don't feel you have to write up to the word limit. The key thing is getting across what you need to let us know. The first one's a pretty standard question in terms of why you want to do this. I'll give you some things to think about when you're answering that particular question in a second. The impact questions and how you challenged other people, again, I'll give some pointers as to what you might want to think about that as well. And then the final question is kind of matching some of those things up and actually highlighting from that table where you've done some of these things. So you can write these things freely, but as you'll be aware, if you've ever done any shortlisting before, what we tend to do is look through the criteria and try to find the evidence for those. So in terms of how you structure that, it's just bear that in mind as we're actually looking through that last statement. Okay. Now on these earlier parts, the first question in particular, I'll bring you back to the purpose of the Research Goal Network. So hopefully, if you're clear about what the purpose is, then that will help you think about why anybody would want to be an ELE. In terms of the other ones, I'll come back to some recommended reading later for these other questions. I said I'd give you some pointers for those. Some recommended reading right at the end, which will give some pointers as to where you might find information to help you. After the application, there will be an interview. And as part of the interview, there are 3 subparts to it. So there's a task, a presentation, and some questions. Now in the task, you will be given some information and you've got to try to make sense of that information as a source of evidence. So you'll be asked to think really critically about the quality of evidence that that source of information provides. In the presentation, which will be very brief and very short, it's really focusing about implementation of changes to practice. And again, there's something that you might think about later when we look through the supporting documents with that. The final part is about almost what you've learned from this, and how you've overcome things that have been initially quite difficult, because part of the work of an ELE is to deal with challenging circumstances. And the likelihood is, if you've stretched yourself and tried to change something, there's been some difficulty that you've had to overcome with that. And that is really valuable experience for an ELE. The final part is kind of some suggested reading, if you like, and some pointers as to when you look at that reading as to the sorts of things you might not want to miss. So the first one, which I know many of you will be familiar with, is the EEF implementation guidance. I've put some short links in here to help you find those. The second is the EEF Teaching Learning Toolkit. And the third one is one you may or may not have come across before. It's the IEE evidence, the IEE, which is the Institute for Effective Education, Engaging with Evidence Guide. And particularly page 9 gives a good summary of how you might engage with evidence. So just pointing out some things that you really want to draw your attention, because some of these are quite big, so that you know what it is that really can focus on. So in the implementation guidance, you'll find the implementation process, and there are some reminders in the guidance about how this is a process and not a product. There's also some points about how much work goes on before you deliver an intervention. There's a lot of decision making, trialing and refining, and so on. And that's something that people set to make changes in school, they often miss some of this out. So it is worth just drawing your attention to that first half of the cycle. It starts at the top and works clockwise round. The second thing to really highlight with this is about how you would always think about planning for sustaining something from the very outset. So you don't kind of decide whether it works and then think about how you could make it better or bigger. You should be making those decisions up here and perhaps here, and then talking about starting small and scaling up. And the idea that that process might repeat itself many times over. Also, with the implementation guidance, you'll come across the implementation plan, which is a document well worth drawing your attention to if you've not seen it before. It's a form of action planning that's focused on addressing an issue that you've identified using evidence-informed approaches and thinking about what the outcomes look like. So also within that recommended reading is the EEF Teaching Learning Toolkit. Now, most people have seen this, and this was developed in conjunction with the Sutton Trust. Now, just a note of caution when people use this, one of the things that people tend to do is they tend to see the headlines and perhaps not delve as deeply as they should. So if you were to click on one of the interventions, say behavior interventions, as I've highlighted here, it will go into further detail about this. So people look at this and say, feedback's a great thing, I'm going to do more feedback, without reading the detail about what actually happens. Now, if you look at this particular section on behavior interventions, right at the bottom, there are things that you should consider as part of implementing that. And again, one of the things that people struggle with sometimes is they don't read as far down as that and therefore don't actually get those key points. It has even more detail because in the top where they've got some of the behavior interventions that have been done, there is quite a lot of detail about each specific one. So if you were thinking of doing one, then you could look at one of them, let's say the good behavior game, and actually find out quite a lot of detail about it, such as where it was trialed, how many schools were involved, and what the context of those schools were. So you can see whether that context would match you. So if you were trying to do this and you're a secondary school, then you might think, well, this perhaps doesn't fit quite as well. Yeah. Now, also, it is worth noting that these are summaries of many, many different types of interventions. So that plus 3 months that it's talking about here in terms of progress and how much it costs and how secure the evidence is, which is what those symbols represent, is a summary of many different types of research. And just to give you a snapshot of that, we've got lots of different headings from the toolkit here, and they've plotted all the different studies in terms of months progress across this axis here. So you can see for arts participation that the studies are generally grouped around positive. This side's positive, that side's negative, grouped towards a positive, and they're all pretty close together. But there's quite huge variation in something like a behavior intervention. So this one would be one to really look into. This one might be one to avoid. And the same logic applies here. So when you see that plus however many months, behind those headlines, like the teaching assistant one, which is a classic, just goes to show how teaching assistants can be deployed brilliantly. But equally, they can be deployed where they don't really add any value, or in fact, subtract value. So just be mindful of the headlines and what goes beyond them. And obviously, that's something that you can think about when you're going through this process. Now, those are things I've already shared in many different arenas, public areas, and so on. So this is all in the public domain. People have already seen this kind of thing, but I just think it's useful to just draw your attention to this when you're thinking about applying to be an ELE.